This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl, BK, and join with me today is my amazing, spectacular co-host, Manly Jack Manley.
Yes, indeed. This week, I believe coming to you straight from the doghouse because I made BK go through it this week, folks.
Oh, yeah, you did. And by go through, it means you made me suffer through probably one of my least favorite, almost hated genres of film for this episode. I cannot believe you, Jack.
Well, I can't believe it's a genre that you don't like. I mean, this is like a foundational disagreement between you and I, because I am a huge aficionado and lover of the historical epic. And it just is not your bag.
Absolutely not. I don't know what it is. Maybe I've just had too much of it. Maybe I'm desensitized. Maybe there's certain cliches. I got to work through and dissect what I don't like about them. But for the most part, I'm really not a fan of period pieces at all. I cannot get into them. They are not my jam.
Well, you heard it here, folks. That's 2 seasons of Film Nerds. That's it. We're done. No, I'm kidding.
What?
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But no, we are having this discussion today because I wanted to watch one of the last true great high-budget historical epics for the podcast. So we dove into 2003's Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, directed by Peter Weir and adapted for the screen by Peter Weir and John Coley, based on the Jack Aubrey series of novels that were written by Patrick O'Brian. So BK, right now already I'm throwing at you this long-winded literary sounding title. I'm throwing a novel at you. I'm giving you so much setup that you're not going to enjoy.
I'm already snoozing. I'm already half asleep.
And the movie started with a slow burn.
It did. It did. It had, let me tell you, this film had so much going against it for me to enjoy. Like, genuinely. I was kind of on the fence, but here at the Film Nerds, we really enjoy exploring all genres and giving all different types of films a genuine chance. So I was pressed about the challenge. And let me tell you, Jack, I was not going to let you live this down ever if it wasn't something I could get behind.
And I'm glad you gave it a chance because I do feel that it's a very different kind of film. It's something that I pointed it out when we were previewing it last week, is it really keeps the human touches and the characters as the forefront of this huge spectacle around them. And I think it's a very unique twist on what Hollywood usually does, which is build a grandiose spectacle and throw a bunch of characters into it. And I was wondering if you noticed that difference when we got into this.
Yeah, I definitely would have to say that I might have not noticed the difference, but that was something that spoke to me, if that makes sense. Like I said a little bit earlier, I don't really know what I don't like about other films of this nature, but I do know what I look for when I want a film to speak to me, and things that are very character driven with very immense investment in the production and creation of the piece are all kind of avenues for me to get in it. And once the story kind of unveiled the main characters, it was really building the story behind and then showed you the crew. I kind of got into it. I'm not going to lie.
That's progress. That's more than I expected there.
It is very much more. It really was like I was booing it. We did a viewing of this for our Discord server. We like to share some of our films with the community, and I was literally audibly booing it while we went to start. But I definitely would have to say my perception of it changed probably halfway through. It did take about halfway through for me to get genuinely invested.
I'm glad you got invested because I think it speaks to something that I really feel strongly about this film. Now, granted, I have an innate bias into liking films like this because I love my history and I love my liberties taken with history for the purposes of drama. So this is right up my alley. But from a film history perspective as well, I think it's really important to note that for a long time, Master and Commander was sitting at the tail end of one of film's most celebrated traditions. Since we've been making feature-length films, like some of the first ever features, were big budget, for the time, grandiose historical epics. One of the landmark films of the early era of film, Gone with the Wind, was a huge big budget historical epic. Stuff like Lawrence of Arabia, The Great Escape, and Mutiny on the Bounty defined the era of the 50s and 60s in Hollywood. It's a way that we have always used film as a medium for the grandiose and for the epic, in the same way that the oldest literary traditions, we have Gilgamesh on tablets. I've talked a lot about old stories and old literature on this podcast this year for some reason, but it's that binding idea of humanity that we want to tell these epic tales. And we kind of stopped doing that in the mid-thousands, right at the end of this era when stuff like Enemy at the Gates, Master and Commander, The Last Samurai, and Troy, finally in 2004, really kind of the end note for a long time on this tradition. And while it has started to resurge with stuff like Sam Mendes's 1917 and Edward Berger's All Quiet on the Western Front, we're still in this era where Hollywood will only throw its large budgets at science fiction and fantasy and superheroes. And on one hand, I think that's a great thing because the nerds are getting to eat. But at the same time, I feel like we are not giving ourselves as many avenues to tell those epic, tall tales that we've always had in our culture for as long as human beings have existed. And Master Commander reminds me that we're missing out on that. It gives me a lot to lament, but it's also something I'm very nostalgic about.
I love hearing that from you. And I'm actually really glad you kind of laid out the history of these types of films. I didn't watch many of the first batch that you said, but I did catch a lot of the second batch of films that you said right before things kind of went quiet. And I guess I kind of remember how I felt about them. They were very big stories or epic tales, but they weren't really human behind it. There wasn't something that kind of grounded the story in something remotely relatable, if I'm being honest. And sometimes some of those films are borderline controversial in their representation of that material. But Master and Commander, the more I learned about the production and the behind the scenes of this, is kind of getting way more cred than I ever thought I would give it.
It's something that over the years that have passed since it came out has become, if anything, its own kind of cult classic, which is very weird to say about a series of novels that this was initially based on that was much beloved in its own cult right, but was thought when it was being made that it would become this big budget franchise for the studio when it was being made. So it's this very weird, hot and cold kind of series, and always has been since it was conceived by an author who himself is a very kind of reclusive, hard to pin down guy.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So this was a series of novels. I thought it was based off of a book, but I didn't know there was a series of books. That makes sense if they wanted to dive into it. What in tarnation? You got to put me onto these books, Jack.
Well, what is known as the Aubrey Maturin series is a collection of, I kid you not, 20 finished works and one unfinished work that was published after the author's death, Patrick O'Brian, after he passed in 2000. And it's a series of novels that is largely set around the friendship of Captain Jack Audrey and the ship's doctor, Stephen Maturin, during the Napoleonic War period. So it is essentially, in so many words, it's kind of Napoleonic War fan fiction, if I'm being a little facetious.
Wait, so you mean to tell me the novels aren't like real life events, but it's kind of like a fanfic, is what you're trying to tell me?
It's based off of taking liberties with the Napoleonic War setting to tell this very compelling series of tales aboard this ship, the HMS Surprise.
So it's a fanfic. It's a fanfic. I love that.
Listen, whether or not we like to admit it, some of the most successful stories of all time have been loosely based off of history and have been, at some level or not, fan fiction. So it is what it is.
I love that, though. I know there's maybe like a stigma on fan fiction, but for me, it's awesome because there is some greatness to talk about the attention to detail in the setting and kind of playing on your own story, but grounding it within a reality that did exist. So to hear that these novels are kind of that in their own way, I kind of love this even more, Jack. I did not think it was going to be possible, but that right there might have done it.
And as I alluded to it earlier, the novels being this kind of sort of loosely based work on a moment in history, it kind of reflects the author, Patrick O'Brian. He is this very, hard to pin down, reclusive guy. He didn't let many details about his life ever become public or go out to the press. What little we do know about him is kind of mired in, was he telling the truth or was he lying about it? Perfect example is that he served in World War II as an ambulance driver. That we can prove through his service records and through family accounts. But he likes to say that he was in British intelligence in some capacity, as he claimed some agency with some assortment of letters that was changing all the time. But there doesn't seem to be any way or anyone who will substantiate this service in British intelligence. And so he has this story, amongst others, where he has this history of telling his own tall tales. He claimed to have limited sailing experience, yet when he actually went on a sailing expedition in the 1990s, he was totally incapable of making his way around a boat. So he's a very weird, very odd kind of guy, but you kind of need that oddness about you, I think, to take a historical period and to take just enough liberty and to aggrandize it just enough to create the sweeping kind of, half art, half entertainment tales that the Aubrey Matherin series was seen as for the large part of its existence.
Wow, I'm fascinated. So you mean to tell me homie's writing about himself, kind of, sorta, but not really? And then playing it into this setting with their own spin on it? Like, this is awesome. I just didn't think this type of, writing existed. I feel so dumb for saying that, though, Jack. Oh.
Well, I'd say it's more that he's just taking advantage of his own natural talents for aggrandizement. I think that's a more fair way of
I'm
putting
being a little
it.
Savage, aren't I?
No, you're just predisposed to disliking this because of all the reasons we've set up in the preamble of this little podcast today. But despite all of this, I am forging forward because you can't take away from the fact that there are so many interesting stories around this series and around this movie. So I'm gonna keep going forward with this history.
Okay, I'm ready. Buckle me up. So how many series? 20 novels. That's what I'm saying. In one series, one unfinished work. How does this book even make its way to film? Where is the transition here? Was it super popular? Were people clamming for the rights to get it adapted? Or is it something that kind of flew under the radar for a really long time and someone picked it up as their passion project?
More the latter. O'Brien's whole writing career was kind of like that, to be honest. After World War II, he settles in Wales and resumes writing and starts his notorious reclusive streak. But he slowly develops this cachet very steadily as being a quality British novelist. And he does a couple of children's works in the 50s called The Golden Ocean and the Unknown Shore that start developing these ideas around the Aubrey Matherin series. And finally in 66 is when he actually gets the call from publisher J.P. Lippincott to ask him to fill this sort of void they had in the market for nautical novels. And so in 69, when it's released all over in the US, UK, and Ireland, but it's more quietly popular. Like I said earlier, it's kind of a cult classic series that eventually develops into a cult classic film. So it's quiet for a long, long time. But as with so many things, in the 1990s, when culture was in high demand and everything was about getting eyes and getting frequent attention, a publisher saw an opportunity for this series to surge in popularity.
Interesting. Okay, very interesting. Because the way we watched some BTS stuff to prep for this, and they're talking about the novel, the way they talked about Orion, I'm like, this person's hella popular. This has got to be a fire novel series. And not to say it's anything bad with it, but I'm thinking about it now, and the way you said it, cult classic. I think liking, novels and stories about ships and the open sea is a pretty cult thing, if you don't mind me saying.
I think you're dead on in that. I could remember reading a couple of these niche novels growing up, and it really is its own subgenre within literature that kind of gets swept under the radar a little bit. But it does surge in popularity because in 1993, this guy Starling Lawrence becomes editor-in-chief at publisher W.W. Norton and was a passionate fan of the series. He puts a lot of work into pushing these novels in the American market, and they gain a huge readership and immense critical acclaim in the mid-90s. And that's what not only gets Hollywood's attention, but it marks this first example of many that we would see around this project of people around these novels. As you mentioned before, there must be something very special about them, because Lawrence was a passionate believer in the novels and would basically pass the rights off to someone who was, if anything, equally passionate about this project, despite having no pre-existing relationship with Patrick O'Brian.
Really, I'm curious. I love stories about people who are hella passionate on adapting source material. So I got to know the hands. Where did it go? How did it get there? Who is it with?
At this point, the project becomes the baby of Fox executive Tom Rothman, who at the time was the president of 20th Century Fox. This is a guy who had a considerable credibility within Fox for the work he had done heading up certain divisions, including heading up Fox Searchlight in 1994, which was the first time an indie division had ever been part of a major studio in Hollywood history. So Rothman had this firm grounding in understanding how to work within the studio system, but also understanding the need to push passion projects across the finish line. And so he's looking at this point, at the turn of the century, basically, for big properties to establish his upcoming tenure, because he's been named as the next CEO of all Fox filmed entertainment. And what project has he been dying to make, BK? An entry into the Aubrey Maturin series.
It's just, I'm sorry, I'm a hater. I just can't imagine that I'm CEO of Fox Film Entertainment. Turn of the new century. We're out here. Let's make a movie about ships and bridge the gap between this novel series and make it a franchise. Like, that's just such a lofty goal. Like, what crazy ambition this guy has.
I mean, to be fair, one of the highest grossing movies of 2003 was about adapting a ride about ships. So let's not knock it, shall we? I kid. But it falls into the hands of Rothman at this point, and he wants to get a high-level director on this. So he pitches the project to one Peter Weir, who, if you are a big fan of film, you know at this point was coming off of a massive success critically with The Truman Show.
Wow. Wait, The Truman Show to this?
As a matter of fact, Truman Show and this are Peter Weir's third and second last films.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. That's so interesting. I'm curious on the choice and the selection. I guess maybe Peter has a lot of backing behind him, not just on the success of the film, but maybe the people that he's worked with?
Well, Peter Weir has done some of the most memorable projects of the 80s and 90s. You know, I mentioned The Truman Show. He also had the Dead Poets Society underneath his belt. And he's a guy that really is noted in Hollywood and noted on set as a director who's a real leader. He's a very subtle kind of visionary. He works very similar in the kind of a style of like a Sidney Lumet, he waxes lyrical about film when he's directing. He brings people into his vision very lyrically, very fluidly, and is a very calming but very steadfast presence. Not unlike how Captain Jack Aubrey comes across in this film, by the way. But Weir wasn't sold on this really initially. He was kind of needed to be convinced to do this project, and I will say that O'Brien had a hell of a way of trying to convince Peter Weir to do this project.
What did he do? Send a microwave or something crazy like that? I heard that story once before.
No. I gotta tell this story just because it's too interesting and just too quirky not to include in the podcast.
Okay, go ahead.
So when Peter Weir is going to meet O'Brien to be pitched this project and is kind of on the fence about doing it, he meets with Patrick, and Patrick says, I'm not going to pitch you anything. I have a gift for you. And he goes away, and he comes back with a sword. And this man, deadpan serious, stands in front of Peter Weir, genuflects the sword to him, and says, will you take command?
Are you serious right now, Jack? Are you messing with me?
No, deadpan serious. According to Peter Weir, that is exactly what happened.
How do you... I don't know how you'd say no to that, if I'm being honest. Like, that's like the writer of the novels coming to you essentially in a weird form of knighthood. Like, the visual I have of it is hilarious. Oh my goodness. You can't say no after that.
Weir didn't say yes, but he kind of didn't say no either. At this point in the project, he's really just thinking about where in the series he would want to go, and ultimately, he didn't want to start with the first novel, which is called Master and Commander, because he found that it didn't have enough action aboard the vessel. It was solely centered around Aubrey and Maturin's friendship, and he felt that a more successful way of doing the project would be to kind of resume the story in the middle of it, have them in the high sea, and set things aboard the ship, with the friendship occurring naturally. So Weir clearly had the idea you see manifest in the final product. He just wasn't sold on it until he had a happening, I should say, or just a sort of a chance encounter, really, when he was trying to get in the mood thinking about this film and going to boating festivals in England.
Okay, boating festivals, I guess, makes sense. But I have two things. One, I didn't know there were boating festivals. I'm an idiot. Two, this person really invested in ships. I mean, I guess you'd have to kind of commit and get the feel and get some sort of inspiration, especially if the book's alone and the writer of the novel and series coming to you, giving you a sword, getting essentially on one knee and sword, asking for your hand in holy film matrimony. I can only think of the next thing to do is put yourself in an environment that gets you the closest thing to British and water and ships.
While Peter Weir is going around these boating festivals, when he's in Halifax, he happens upon a ship called the Rose, which was an actual replica of a British frigate called the Rose, which had served during the American Revolution, but had been scuttled in 1779. And at the time, it was the only recreation of a real British frigate in the world. So Weir, inspired by this boat, goes back to LA, deciding, you know what, I am interested in this project, but I'd like to do the 10th book, The Far Side of the World. Again, pushing this idea that they need to be at sea and that the friendship becomes what the movie is about and that the spectacle exists to draw people in as the hook. But he wanted to also have the studio purchase the Rose as the HMS Surprise. And to his delight, the studio buys the frigate.
Listen, if the director you want comes to you and says, listen, I'm thinking about maybe doing the thing you wanted me to do, but hear me out. I'm going to need you to throw some money right quick on this ship. It's my muse. And it could double as a set. Help me out?
It sounds vaguely like a timeshare. It's like, hey, listen, you're going to get 2 years of my work, but in return, I'm going to need you to buy this boat. Like, right. It sounds a little bit like a scam.
A little. That's why I'm laughing so hard. But, like, I kind of love this story because it's totally right. Like, as a creative, that is your direct muse. You need to look at that, analyze it, be in it. That's going to be I feel like visualization of something tangible, because taking on, again, like you said, the 10th book, which is, I assume, where the plot is and maybe the main action of the story, and then kind of mushing it together, you're really going to get, at least what I think, some stoppage and maybe butt heads when it comes to the writing here, especially if it sounds like to me that we're going to start towards the middle, literally the middle of a franchise or a series. I'm curious how the studio kind of took that news.
Well, I think the studio, if I was the producer and they were worried about me starting in the middle of a series, I would have just said, hey, listen, it worked for Star Wars. And I probably wouldn't have gotten very many notes after that.
You're right.
But if I'm being serious, Weir and John Coley, the gentleman who helped him adapt this screenplay, they opted for a solution that I think is more elegant, which is that when they ran into the more fractious and difficult parts of the script to piece together, or parts where context was needed, what they did is they amalgamated scenes and moments from 5 separate novels within the series to create one intro story about the ship and its crew, again, with the aspect of the friendship revealing itself through the course of this tale that was being told. So they really found, I think, kind of an elegant way around it, which is that, hey, if the material right at the middle of the series doesn't perfectly hold up to our expectations, let's find this material from the end of the series to bring in context. Let's find this material from earlier in the series to make sure people aren't lost at this point in the story. So I think it's a very smart solution.
I love that. I do. I really, really do love that they had the freedom to kind of do that, because you do hear horror stories of having to kind of be strict to a one-to-one because of pressures of the adaptation, or entire rewrites because they don't like the source material. So to hear that it's more of a collaboration with the works that existed and with the writer and the team that has pulled these stories apart and brought them to screen, it took a lot of tender love and care and collaboration between a lot of parties to make this happen.
And a lot of money, because again, this is Tom Rothman's baby. So when I say he threw the full weight of Fox filmed entertainment behind this, I mean the full weight. This got a budget of $150 million in 2002,
Insane.
with every studio resource being made available by Rothman to the shoot. And to put that in context, BK, the year prior, Spider-Man had been filmed for $133 million. So this cost more than Spider-Man.
Oh my gosh. And that had like CGI, like there's elements of that. And then thinking of this, I'm like, oh man, yeah, all the practical effects definitely ain't coming cheap. I mean, you bought a boat.
Not only did you buy a boat, you had to retrofit it and repaint it to make it look good for the film. You had to make sure it was completely seaworthy because you were going to need to do some filming out on the open ocean on that during the course of the film. Then you needed to build a second one because doing an entire shoot at sea is impossible. So, of course, what you do is you go down to Baja Studios in Mexico and you go to the tank that was built for the Titanic and you build an entire replica of the replica. And then you put the replica of the replica on a gimbal so that you can enable the whole ship to move. And then, to make it look realistic, you engage in a massive 3-month-long prop-making effort in early 2002, courtesy of the crew that had just finished making props for the Lord of the Rings series.
Yes. See, this is what gets me hype in it. It's the detail to this. When I was finding out how much work went into detailing the ship, I guess that's what I have to call it, like it's a car or something. But it's true. You can make a ship, you could build a ship, but to fill it with the life and the realism that's within the ship, to be able to shoot this movie with the lens that this film takes, it must have taken an army.
Again, financed completely by 20th Century Fox. But that said, it really did take an army of dedicated people to actually get this production across the finish line of physical production over the course of the time it was shot between June and December of 2002. But in a way, that huge regimented effort was benefited by the fact that Weir was working with a cast that was absolutely on board with this effort and was, if anything, falling in line behind him as if he was their own captain. Take a quote from Dead Poet Society, another Peter Weir film, these people were all in "Oh Captain, my Captain" mode.
I feel like you'd have to be. I mean, not only are you literally running a ship and crew, you're figuratively running the film ship and crew at the same time. I mean, figuratively is probably not the right answer. I think you're doing them both literally. But it's kind of amazing to see that all come together. And when I started reading and learning about all the things that were taken and done in order to make this possible, from the training that was used to kind of get everyone on board, but even before that, the casting alone for the extras, yes, our principals, but the crew, that is so important to a ship story. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jack.
No, you're absolutely right. And we'll get to Aubrey and Maturin in this. Trust me, we've got to talk about the principals, but we should take a segment right here to, I think, just jump ahead in our format. We were going to talk about actors a little bit later, but let's just jump ahead in our format real quick to talk about the effort this cast went through on the physical production. Because as BK mentioned, the extras and the background players and the B players in this film are so incredible, and they're mainly drawn from stage actors in the UK, while the extras were drawn from Poland and the United States. And the extras in particular, BK, I want to focus on because the crew really did go through it. They were told at the start of the film by Peter Weir when he pitched the actors that, listen, I think you're right for the part. I think you're right to be in this crew, but it's going to be a really difficult shoot. You're going to be spending half a year in Mexico. You've got all of these difficulties you're going to have to deal with while you're there. You're going to have to learn how to sail. You're going to have to train. And if you don't think you're up for it, let me know now. And he only had one actor drop on him when he pitched that question to them. The whole crew had to learn to sail and man a British frigate. They had to learn ranks. They had to train under those ranks. And still, Peter Weir got that kind of investment. That should just tell you the kind of guy he is and how he's perceived as a director.
Oh, yeah, that's a testament. When you can get people to sign up for this type of spectacle, it really is, because it's hard to believe that it happened, that it was made. I know we all watched the movie, right? But when you look at how it was made, you're kind of in awe at the commitment, the passion that everybody went into doing this for the crew alone. I mean, some of the conversations with the casting directors looking for those extras really were tasked with making sure that they were representative of the time. They made sure to include a diverse cast. I remember vocally being very excited to Jack being like, oh my gosh, I didn't think I was going to see a single brown person in this film at all. I thought I came in with the lowest bar. And to see not only a bit of the indigenous peoples coming around, depending on where they are in the location throughout the film, but the crew itself having Africans there, having people from, I believe they were saying Malaysia as well would have been where they were from at the time, and seeing that diversity within the extra crew and knowing it was intentional and that they were looking for a vibe, a passion, and things internal rather than just looks to really tell this story. It made me so interested and had so much more love for this film than I had initially.
I love that it subverted your expectations a little bit. Like, I'm guessing you were coming into this expecting, like, powdered makeup and wigs and, like, court intrigue.
Oh, 100%. I was like, where is the political court intrigue? Someone's son. Oh, no, the God save the queen. Like, I was like, are you serious? I was like, if I'm lucky, the bad people might be brown. If I'm lucky. So I was very presently surprised to see, quite frankly, a decent amount of representation in this. Like, I was out of nowhere, definitely put me in a weird position. I got taken aback by it. I was like, oh, wow. Wait, really? I didn't think this film was going to do this or go there or cared enough. Like, that alone showed me and was my first hint at how much care was kind of put into, one, the historical accuracies, but two, being able to tell a very realistic and like a human approach.
Not only was it cast in a very realistic and representational way, but it was shot in a very realistic and honest way to how crewing and living on a ship would actually go down. Weir's aesthetic, all of pre-production and throughout production, was that he wanted organized chaos. So he blocked the whole film to make it very organic to what it felt like in that actual situation. And he wanted the way he shot it to reflect that as well. So he wanted every scene to feel a bit like a documentary. Like you're kind of coming in during a snippet of a conversation, and that you're that fly-on-the-wall observer, almost like Barbara Koppel's filming Harlan County on the ship. That kind of style developed for this big production piece. It's a very astonishing and personal way to, again, bring you into the human mindset of this film beyond just the spectacles that you're seeing. And yes, you do get it shot in that incredible, beautiful Hollywood style. They had the budget to only shoot exteriors during certain hours of the day. Pretty much everything in the big budget scenes was shot with cranes or Steadicam due to the tight confines of the ship, but they had the freedom to show the action and do it like that. But it was really, honestly, down to the fact that Peter Weir wanted this to come across with an edge of realism to it, that the film succeeds in having said realism.
Well, I mean, I feel like you better get realism when you're literally at sea for some substantial shots for this film. Like, yes, they used the tank and stuff and did sets. There were a lot of sets used. Some of the inner cabin shots were full sets with blue screens on the outside. But putting that all aside, homies were at mother effing sea. Talk about realism. I could not be an actor. I could barely be on a boat. Put me on a ship, put me in the ropes, and then tell me to act? I'm absolutely not.
I will say, I think it is worth noting the time that they did shoot this film at sea, those 10 days that they were out there to do those full shots of the boat, because while they were doing this, they also broke filmic ground. They were the first ever non-documentary production to ever set foot on and shoot footage in the Galapagos Islands, believe it or not.
Wow, I had no idea. That was actually one of my main questions I was going to get to as we kind of got through the story. And I was very curious when we were watching if they were filming on location. I know we said they were, around Mexico, and a lot of the film is about being in those seas, or at least somewhere around there. I'm really bad with geography. So I was curious if they did shoot in the Galapagos, and also super curious about all of the animals there. Like, did they have ship and animal budget money? Because that's a lot of money.
Well, they actually did try to substitute the Galapagos Islands at first by doing some of the shots in the Baja area of California, because there are certain topographical features that do match the biomes of the Galapagos Islands. But they did end up going to shoot there with basically Weir, Bettany, and a skeleton crew to do certain among the shots. And they didn't actually have a budget on the film for trained animals. This was all wildlife in the Galapagos that the team was working alongside experts and naturalists to get the actors as close to as possible while remaining ethical and still getting the shot. So when you're seeing those animals on screen, that was not shipped down to the Galapagos from Hollywood. That is an animal that has been living on and around those islands its entire life.
You're kidding. You're kidding, right?
Absolutely not.
That is insane. I literally can't remember the last time I've heard that happening in a film. That's not a common occurrence, is it?
I mean, if you think about it logically, the Galapagos are one of the most protected places in the entire world when it comes to biodiversity. You can't just be bringing outside animals to the Galapagos.
I guess you're right. We don't want to mess up no ecosystem now.
Like, we don't need Australian cane toads in the Galapagos. We are set there.
We're good. Oh, wow. So interesting. I would have not thought that all of this kind of went into this production. I don't know. You think big Hollywood budget period piece, and a lot of the time you think of maybe what you think of Marvel now, which is just like green screens, baby sets, and, whitewashing. And that is very much not what I'm getting every step of the way.
There was real care put into this production from the word go, and it extended into the post-production, quite honestly, with the way they created the soundscape for this film. Like, I know that you saw me focusing on this during the watch party, but that opening scene, when you just have that eerie silence, and then the flash in the fog, and then the sound of the whoosh of the cannonball hitting the ship comes in, just this dramatic upswell of sound. Like, please know that was a focus. These guys won the Oscar for Best Sound Editing for a reason, and it's because Weir and Coley literally scoured the novels for examples of specific sound cues and based their audio approach off of the sound descriptions from within the novels for where they put in cues in the story. And there was a heavy emphasis on using like actual cannons and rifles from the era to make the sounds of combat. So they went to extraordinary lengths to use, again, the novels as the guide.
Wow. I love that you brought us there too with the sound, because you are right. It is an extremely important one for the film and for bringing us in and immersing us in the realism of it, but also really to double down on that realism, being out at sea, like being a sailor, sea shanties, music, and the sounds of nature, those raw sounds of life. That's all they had. Like back in the day, like there was no artificial everything. You couldn't put no iPods in. You know what I'm saying? Like there shouldn't be a crazy musical score that overpowers things. Like this should be sound that is really intentional, realistic, and something that would be believable to have been heard at the time. So I loved that about this.
But at the same time, I love that you bring up music, because music did serve a central role in this film and a central role in the friendship of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin in this film. Because you had both Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany playing violin and cello respectively, and relating as friends through the music and having these intimate scenes with each other in this same cabin where they're playing music with one another. So again, sound is being used in this film as a conveyance for story and as a conveyance for dramatic cues within what you are seeing on the screen. And I think that that's actually, it's kind of an elegant way of getting into our principal actors and getting into the principal and core friendship at the heart of this film, because it's a project that has so much care and kindness and love around it. And I find that so interesting that it is all reflecting off of this story that at the core of it is about these two friends who are butting heads over being friends to one another versus the bonds and the restrictions of duty.
I'm glad you brought us there with that relationship, because that is, if I'm being honest, and maybe for any of our listeners who aren't too into history stuff but have been listening this far and are still on the fence about watching this, you're weird, but I love you. The story between these two people is really, I think, the bread and butter. So to find out that that is the root of the novels and to see that that kind of translated so well, not knowing that, is really exciting for me. And as a creative, it's a testament that the message and I think the purpose of the film was received, if I was able to pick that up. And kind of bringing it back to the music, I think the best moments of seeing this relationship, correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but is when they are playing music together, when they're playing the cello and the violin and just kind of being themselves completely in contrast to the harsh reality that they're around every day.
I do love those moments, and I love how it's used thematically. You know, for instance, when Stephen gets shot by the officer who's trying to hit the errant bird while he's running around on the deck, the way that you understand that Aubrey is going to make a decision to help his friend is you see him look at this chair with this cello sitting there, and you see the absence of Maturin, and you see the change in Aubrey's demeanor in that scene. Little cues like that, and little moments where the music becomes that core moment where you see the friendship. It's such an interesting thing. And I also love these scenes too, because if you know a little bit about the behind the scenes, that work that went into doing those scenes properly speaks to both the investment of Crowe and Bettany in this film, which, just by the way, BK, these two took this film because of Peter Weir. Again, the power of Peter Weir bringing people to this project.
I was going to ask, like, is this a film where they needed to get AAA talent? AAA is probably not A-listers. I don't know. I used video game terminology there for anyone curious. AAA actors to get kind of investment. I know like a lot of money was invested already from the studio, but you still kind of worry about perception and you're looking for your leads in the film. Was it something they knew right away? Hey, we need someone who is a very strong actor, someone who has, you know, a history behind them. Like, we don't want this film to make a new actor. We want someone seasoned here with this role. I'm curious what the process was.
Well, Peter Weir really had fellow Aussie Russell Crowe in mind as his first choice. And so he sent it to him early on in the process. And Crowe thought the script was interesting, but he wasn't exactly excited by it. he was more excited, again, as I mentioned, by working with Peter Weir and that potential prospect. I mean, he revered the guy and the work that he had done in his career and the way that he had impacted the world of film, and he loved his process. So, out of respect for Weir, Crowe went and he read the source material to bone up on the subject, and he read the second draft and liked it a little bit better. While he tried to kind of walk away once or twice, it was about working with Weir that brought him onto the project. And it was Weir seeking him out in turn initially because he was, in fact, attracted to that powerful A-list presence to anchor the film. But it was Crowe, honestly, who would find the way to get Bettany involved with this role, because initially there was concern that despite the fact that Bettany was screen testing very well for it, that Weir wasn't going to go with him because of a little film called A Beautiful Mind.
A Beautiful Mind. Help me out, Jack. I don't think I know this one.
2001, Best Picture Oscar, Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany, acting together 2 years before this came out.
Crickets.
I hadn't seen that movie in 20 years, but that might need a revisit. It's a biopic. It's interesting enough, but really, there was a concern that Bettany might not get this role of Maturin because people were going to too closely associate at the time their work together on A Beautiful Mind.
Oh, that makes sense. I see now. So that they were just in a film together, pretty much playing like the title characters. Why, maybe audience might not like having them in it again. It's just another film. Are they going to be able to play differently? This is an entirely different subject now. I see the reservations, and I'm really glad they didn't let that stop them.
Well, I mean, it almost stopped them, but Russell Crowe kind of tricked Peter Weir into the interest. He basically told him when his name came up, Paul Bettany, yeah, he's more of a musician than an actor. Because he knew a phrase like that would just rankle and get into Peter Weir's head, and he would have to look more closely at the guy. And so it was through Crowe, in a way, kind of needling him towards paying attention to Bettany's screen tests more, that Bettany ends up getting the role.
Wow. I love that. And also, that's so astute. That means, I feel like Crowe did his homework, because the characters they're both playing, that connection to music and being a musician was on the money. So to say that, yeah, it was kind of cryptic in a way, a little mind gamey, but also very astute of him to say that. That's so funny.
I love that we are bringing these guys up and we're sort of getting into our conversation on our two principals through these music scenes, because I think one of the interesting facets about those scenes in particular is it's the one spot in the film where they are able to drop, as you mentioned previously, and I agree with you, all of those pretenses of duty and all of the ego of pursuing this ship, the Acheron, that they are desperate to catch. And they are able to stop walking that fine line of where they're butting heads, and they're just able to be friends and experience that camaraderie and have friendship as a restorative quality within what they are going through. And those are the moments at which they gain power.
It really is a fine line there, whether or not they are, I don't know. It's hard for me to articulate it because I kind of was torn with the captain and the concept of walking that fine line. Is it because of the job? Is it because of me? Is this something I just want to do because I need to see it through? I really resonated with that internal turmoil personally.
I should say, we are putting the synopsis for the film in now 50 minutes into the podcast. I mean, that just shows how eager we were to talk about this. But really, yeah, in his pursuit as the captain of the ship HMS Surprise of the friendship, the Acheron, and the way that this captain of the friendship is every bit his equal, and being stuck in this cat and mouse game, it tests the bonds of the friendship because he's already dealing in this role of having his best friend serving on his ship, of having to balance the friendship aspect of his relationship with Maturin with the needs and the bonds of duty. But the reason this situation strains on Aubrey as much as it does, I feel, is because Aubrey has this superseding struggle above that is fixed in his mind of, yes, I've been charged by the Crown to capture this ship, the Acheron, but beyond that, I want the Acheron because they embarrassed me. they snuck up on me in a fog and they made a fool of me, and now I need this ship. And so while Aubrey is going through this intense mental struggle, this friendship, the voice of reason from Stephen coming at him to tell him that, listen, you need to think about this purely in terms of duty and what you mean to this crew and what the crew means to you. That grounding influence becomes grating because it's one struggle too many for Aubrey to deal with.
It does become overwhelming, doesn't it? Because not only does the Acheron, the ship that he's trying to get, humiliate him, but also constantly he's kind of evading and pursuing him. Like he goes through both of those phases of having like the object of your desire, your motivation, your sense of purpose, not only chasing you, but then also out of your reach, just constantly out of your grasp, always like steps ahead. And that kind of theme takes you all the way to the very, very end. That one pivotal thing of your desire is never really going to be obtainable. And even when you think you've thrown it all away and you've kind of grown from it and you hand off what should be your reward, that should be your ship, you give it to someone else, and really the gratification never really fully comes. You never kind of get over it. And that is a little bittersweet in my opinion, which kind of makes the ending of the film so strong as well.
In a way, it's kind of the story of Tantalus from Greek mythology. In the underworld, Tantalus is fated to be stuck under the branches of a fruit-bearing tree by a glade with a pond in it. And every time he reaches up, the branches are just out of reach. And every time he stoops down for a drink, the waters recede just enough for him not to be able to get a drink. And in this, Aubrey is finding out that he's kind of Tantalus. And the only way he makes any real progress and outfoxes the Acheron for once and boards her and seemingly takes her, but not really, as we see with the cliffhanger at the end, it's because he pays attention to his friend. He listens to his friend's interest in naturalism and the search for knowledge, and he indulges in his friend's curiosity the way that you would in a positive friendship. And because he engages in that positive framework and engages with his friend as somebody who loves him, he comes up with the central ploy that allows them to take the Acheron at the end of the day.
I thought the way they were able to kind of get through the story was so fascinating. And you are very, very smart for you to kind of bring up the connection of the friendship, of being able to listen, being able to get out of your own head, and the drive and passion for kind of curiosity and knowledge. I mean, the Acheron, they start off going off about that ship very early on, being like, this ship is unlike any ship we've ever seen before. And they wanted to know what it did, and they wanted to study it. I mean, honestly, that was the closest the captain got to dissecting something. He was able to dissect the ship, the man of the sea, in kind of comparison to his best friend, Stephen, who was the scientist, was the doctor, who did performative surgeries throughout the film, where you could see him physically uncovering that new medical or ecological knowledge of the time. It was interesting to kind of see the juxtaposition with the captain and his curiosity and knowledge for learning more about how to gain that power on the seas.
And it's interesting, too, because I think that ultimately Aubrey's a very dutiful kind of guy, and he approached knowledge in that dutiful sense, where you even see him teaching the young officers how to use a sextant and indulging them in their education. So on one hand, I think he does absolutely see the value of knowledge throughout the film, but I think he only sees the value of practical knowledge at first, and it's when he actually lets Stephen heal on the Galapagos and when he indulges his knowledge for naturalism that he takes that kind of next step in his own understanding. But I come back to this word duty because it's interesting to see how I think that through the lens of Aubrey, that plays out on this ship, because you even see that he feels his duty extends to indulging in and believing in the superstitions and the paranoia of his own crew, matching their mood and matching what they are coming to believe, both about the sort of demonic nature of the way the Acheron is tracking them down and always on their heels, and there are superstitions about members of the crew.
Yeah, I really thought that that angle kind of is what brought me in again. Like, you know, when you're teetering, you're on the fence of whether or not you're really into something. You've been watching, but like, are you watching? And they started to lean more and kind of explore those superstitions of the sea. You know, being someone from the Caribbean, like that is very close to home in that intrigue and talking about what it is to kind of believe in these rituals or sort of I don't want to call them something they aren't, but it did feel kind of ritualistic with how they dealt with the paranoia. And what was the metaphor that they were using to describe the one bad apple on the ship, Jack?
Hallam, the officer, they were calling him a Jonah as a reference to the story of Jonah in the Bible. And in seafaring terms, that was meant to refer to somebody on the ship who cast a cloud of bad luck upon the crew or upon the voyage. And it was something that I think, as you mentioned, it fits very well into the fact that seafaring has always been a fairly superstitious practice because the sea is a very unknowable and unpredictable and terrifying place. I mean, we see it when they go around the Horn of South America, Cape Horn, and they are exposed very briefly to the southern oceans and their massive storms that span the entire globe without being broken by land. And that's a terrifying thing to go through if you are a member of a crew, and maybe the only thing keeping you going is having good omens or believing in fated signs about your travels. So the power of superstition matters to these sailors because it is indicative of the overall health of the voyage and the well-being of the crew. In a way, they are a bellwether for how well the surprise is going to hold together.
Yeah, I love the way you said that. You said that so beautifully, Jack. You were on one today, let me tell you. But I do love that we kind of got a chance to talk about the superstitions because really, I feel like that was probably, I know there were a lot of traumatic scenes that happen when they kind of take the time to show the realness of battle, to show the death, to show the destruction of the ship, and to really see some of these young boys really kind of have their lives taken, but two, become and forced to become men through this journey. I think that story also got me so connected. I remember initially watching it and right away I'm like, they're babies. Look at them. There's so many young boys out at sea with nothing behind them, like little to no education. And those are the officers.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kids that are expected to give these commands in the heat of battle. That can't be lost on you. And in the depiction of making this film honest, it can't be missed that ship warfare at this time, it was a bloody business. So you've got these kids who are, 11, 12 maybe, babies, as you put it, BK. And they are packed into these absolutely cramped gun decks where a cannonball is coming at you at 900 meters per second. And if it breaks through, it's not just the cannonball hitting you square in the face and killing you have to worry about. It's going to send shock waves of splinters flinging into you and 15 or 20 other people who are all going to need a medical attention immediately, or you are going to end up with gangrene and die slowly. It's a brutal environment, and there's a true loss of innocence that these kids have to confront.
It really is. And I think it's like so exemplary shown through every one of the younger officers, especially the ones that are of that rank. Most of the young people weren't common ship folk. They were people who had some sort of stature and were brought here. I feel as if they were brought there to grow and kind of take on their own ship, which you do see how they are learning, gaining positions, rising in the ranks, partly due to necessity and the raw fact of the matter, but also due to competence, seeing these young children be able to step up to the role that's needed for them, be able to perform and be treated the same as their counterparts that may have been double, quadruple their age. I mean, we had old men on that ship taking orders for someone who looks no more than 14. But there was such a great sense of camaraderie. Again, we kind of bring it back to that. And I think it only really got there through really a coming of age story through 4 different young officers that were very, very well, I feel, told throughout the entirety of the film.
I think they're a very interesting series of stories, and they all have very different endings for how they can end up. I mean, for instance, you have Mr. Blakeney, the young kid. He loses his arm in the first battle, but becomes a surprisingly competent officer and a really tough-minded kid, despite the fact that he cannot be, again, a day over 12 years old. And then you see his friend, unfortunately, his buddy who's 14 or 15, get killed in the final battle when he gets the first opportunity to lead a charge. But then you have the sort of high one of these young ranking officers, Will Pullings, be given his own command at the very end of the film. So it's all of kind of the different outcomes you can have when you have to grow and you have to face these challenges. So it's a very poignant way of showing this experience juxtaposed by very different outcomes. And ultimately, it's great because it just furthers what we've been saying about this film, from its principals to its crew to its young officers, is that in all ways, it's very reflective of an honest portrayal of the reality of these ships. And perhaps that's why when it came out, it was reviewed so favorably, to the point where Roger Ebert pointed out what we've been hinting at the entire time, that it achieves the epic without losing sight of the human.
Oh, wow. I felt so silly for saying like human or humanism or I love it when smart people say things that were almost what I said. It makes me feel less dumb. But it's super true and on the nose about it. It really does have this grandiose, epic tale, something that it has to be out of a book written on parchment paper, but tells a story that I feel like you only really get in some contemporary works or noirs. Like, that's the only other film I can think that takes such a great lens and a realistic approach to being human. So maybe I'm starting to see why you like this movie, Jack.
It reminds me, it does put me in mind of the humanism of the new Hollywood movement, or of the indie film movement in a lot of ways. It feels kind of like an indie script, or at least, half of an indie script, tucked into this big budget, high drama on the seas. And I think that's what other people have kind of come to respect about it as we have gotten further from the film. I just wish that the outcome for this film upon its initial release and reception was nearly as favorable as it has been reviewed in a post-mortem kind of sense, because the news for this when it comes out isn't all that great. Or I guess I should say the news for what this could have been isn't great.
Oh no. What happened? Please don't tell me. Who was it competing against in the box office?
Well, so first off, remember, this is Tom Rothman's baby. This is the film that Fox Filmed Entertainment, 20th Century Fox, is putting all its marbles behind for the Oscar season in 2003. It was released in mid-November of that year, specifically to capitalize on that push. And this could have been a huge, wide-sweeping franchise for Fox if it had done the kind of numbers that they were expecting from it. And it comes out, and it does not reach number one at the box office, because in the week it debuts, this makes me mad. There's no easy way for me to say this. The film that beats it in its inaugural week is Elf.
Are you serious right now?
Number 2, Master and Commander, Far Side of the World. Number 1, Elf.
Please stop watching that movie. Gosh, oh my God.
It makes me like...
Sorry, y'all. I had to get that out.
For reasons that have nothing to do with Elf or anyone who's associated with it, that makes me very, very sad. But ultimately, Master Commander, it retained a solid audience, but it never climbed higher than number 2 at the box office, and it makes $212 million globally, which sounds like a lot until you realize that when you throw marketing and advertising on top of the $150 million budget, that's barely making back. It did profit, but just barely. And it didn't profit in the way that you can justify spending a franchise out of it. And it's sad, but like I said early, it was indicative of this shift in what big budget sensibilities were becoming. In 2003, the box office was dominated by escapist and fantasy epics. X-Men 2, X-Men United, Pirates of the Caribbean, Return of the King. These were the films of 2003. Stuff like this, stuff like Last Samurai, it couldn't compete.
I mean, I guess you're right when it comes to the mainstreamers, right? Like the realism is always a hard sell. Like to the point of me existing and being against period pieces, I can't be the only one who's coming in with reservations. Like if I had seen a trailer for this, if I'm being honest, the only driving force would be to come in for the two actors that I knew, maybe. And then would I see it again? Would I tell a friend? I guess I can understand it not, slapping like Return of the King. But at the same time, it's really unfortunate because of the hard work and dedication that went into it. And honestly, just memorable and captivating performances. That really sucks. It actually sucks big time.
And ultimately, it really may stand as the most infamous example in Hollywood history of a franchise that wasn't. And something I've ruminated on for years and I don't have a good answer to. So I'm kind of asking this question into the ethers. But I mentioned earlier in the podcast that Pirates of the Caribbean came out in 2003. Curse of the Black Pearl did, I should say. And I've always wondered that, people go to the theaters in 2003 and there's this very fantastical, very accessible, swashbuckling epic with, Johnny Depp and Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley, and everyone's beautiful and the CGI is really good. And then in mid-November, you have this, little period piece that's hyper-realistic and buckets of blood are being thrown on, preteen children who happen to be serving as officers. And it's highly grounded in Hollywood's historical epic tradition. And were people just tired of seeing ships that year? Were people just tired of historical epics because they had seen a more fantastical alternative? I'll never have a good answer to that, BK, but I'll never also be able to get out of my head that I think Pirates of the Caribbean and its popularity might have been the biggest reason that Master and Commander was a casualty.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, Pirates of the Caribbean has a long history. It being one of the oldest theme park rides.
It got a trilogy and then it got a reboot duology, BK. Okay, I'm not gonna rant.
It's fine. Listen, we could talk about those. We might have to do a special or something because the first three are pretty good. I'm just saying. But I think you're right. It's a fantastical story. It has that superstitious angle that we talked about that was very intriguing for us, but blown up and taken to the proportion of a Lord of the Rings story, right? There was magic, cursed items, skeletons, Davy Jones, that world of pirates and intrigue and kind of seeing the posh British person down on their luck is exactly what I think America wanted to see, unfortunately, because we have to kind of call it like we sees it. Master and Commander is giving me, I guess, a little bone or a little sympathy to some of the people who were at sea. And maybe, the audience just weren't ready for that. They weren't ready to feel bad or feel sorry for that. They wanted to see it as an adventure, see it as a D&D campaign.
Really fair assessment. It's just a shame that this is now kind of a series that is relegated to being, championed online by Russell Crowe and, rumors that it might be in the works to come back. It might not. Patrick Ness, the writer of Monster Calls, might be attached to a project. He might not be. Peter Weir might be unretiring from directing to do it. He might not be. But it's a shame. It really is, because the Aubrey Matherin novels remain this huge morass of untapped potential, these really compelling stories. And we never got around to it. That's how it feels. It feels like we just never got around to making it.
Totally.
I mean, I feel like there's a real shame. Forgive me, BK, but I feel a bit of a rant coming on here.
Oh, true? Hold on. Let me buckle up. Let me take out the glass. Go ahead.
I talked at the beginning of this podcast about lamenting kind of the death of the historical epic. And I am gladdened that we are seeing some films come back that are in that tradition and that they're getting not the high budgets of Marvel, but stuff like 1917 is getting a generous budget. I do see that. But It's just sad to me that we had this last great gasp of historical epics around the turn of the century, around '03 and '04, and that it became a lost art form or got relegated kind of to the background because those are the stories and those are the films that when I think about just enjoying the filmmaking experience, just sitting back and taking in a movie, that's the stuff that I end up thinking about and relating to the most at the core of who I am. Like, yes, I came up on fantastical stories like Indiana Jones and Star Wars and James Bond. That's the foundation. I am firmly willing to admit that. But as I matured as a film viewer and as I started getting into film more as an art form, I started really treasuring stuff like The Great Escape, treasuring stuff like Lawrence of Arabia, really championing lost epics like A Bridge Too Far, Richard Attenborough's film, and wanting this genre to really be something that people see the way that I see it, as this encapsulation of these epic traditions, of these stories that bind us all together. Like, yes, I get that a lot of stuff that has the commonalities that historical epics hit at, it comes across as cheesy and hackneyed and easy. But in a way, it comes across as all those things because it's hitting, like all cliches do, at universal thoughts and feelings that we all have. And I want there to be a place in filmmaking for that again that doesn't throw CGI and superpowers at me every 5 minutes, or that doesn't feel the need to insert a clever quip with every third line of dialogue. I love my superhero films. I love my tongue-in-cheek humor. But I'm sick of it. I've been watching nothing but that for the last almost 20 years now, and I want my historical epics back. I want my realism and my grounding in realism back. I want the tales that bind me to people back in the filmic tradition. And while there's always going to be a fond place in my heart for sci-fi and for fantasy and for what they have been allowed to become, I need this tradition back, BK, and I miss it.
I hear you. I really do. As someone who isn't a history person, as someone who's not a period piece, but I share that sentiment of the stories that they do. They are some of the few stories that are guaranteed to give you that really raw look at a character or at a person even. And unfortunately, it sucks. I want to see it as film. We are the film nerds. We like movies here. But I have to kind of give a little love to our streaming services here in this moment, because there have been a bit more room to grow for that genre. I'm starting to feel in the short series or mini series realm. Honestly, Jack, I would not be surprised if we don't see some sort of HBO Max type situation, limited series over this that's kind of more slow paced and less action, even though there wasn't that much action. But I think I'd be into it. Something a little more focused on the science or the doctor aspect about being out at sea. I think there's something there to explore, because you are right. We are in a drought. We are in a huge, massive drought. And there is a big, big room for it. And I don't think you're the only one calling for a resurgence of this. I just think we've got to find the right time period to get us back into the swing of things.
And I'm just going to say to any prospective directors out there, you can do an epic without remaking The Seven Samurai. It is possible.
Yes, you can. There are multiple options, all right? Listen, get it together. It is 2023 now. There are no excuses.
Oh, man. Well, I appreciate you indulging me in this opportunity to talk about a genre that matters a lot to me. And even though it's not your bag, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you might have actually enjoyed yourself.
No, I definitely had a good time. I like to give an honest review of this. We really don't do our ratings anymore here because we all know we only watch films we really like and they're good. But I definitely was going into this thinking I wasn't going to care about it and that I was going to be, for the first time ever on the podcast, a actual Debbie Downer. Like, I really thought I was going to come on here and be a heckler. And this film was great. Like, highly recommend. If you've seen it and you're listening to this and you haven't seen it in a while, watch it again. You're going to notice so much stuff you've never noticed before. And you're going to get attached to these characters way more than I thought I was going to. I am so glad you shared this with me. This was a good one. It was a good one.
Vindication!
Okay, I might not watch it again, but like, it was good.
Hey, listen, I got one over the line. That's what I wanted.
You did.
But
you did.
But in the interest of extending an olive branch, we can get away from the world of epics next week, because I think it's time we go to something that's pretty close to home and pretty insular. But that doesn't mean it's a bad film by any stretch of the imagination. I'm excited to be shifting gears the way we are for this next episode. I'm really excited.
Oh yeah, we're shifting gears, but in a way, I kind of found a thread through this podcast today. And we're kind of keeping the trend of exploring very realistic, I feel, cut human stories. It might be a little fun and a little corny here and there. We're going to be checking out The Breakfast Club, a amazing 80s classic Brat Pack. I'm excited.
I think it's going to be really... We had to do John Hughes at some point. I'm excited because I really think that, yeah, again, might think it's a little hackneyed and silly, guys, but the reason that it's so hackneyed in some cases, if you watch a John Hughes film, is because Hughes had this supernatural talent for hitting at the commonalities that people deal with when they're struggling with growing up. And I think there's a lot of context in this film for people to really appreciate where they came from and to really indulge in the reality of the traumas that you go through reaching the age of adulthood and the ways in which the situations you deal with your peers really shape you. So I think it's going to be an interesting film to discuss because it is, like Master Commander, focused on the bonds that shape us, but it's not on a ship. It's in detention. Whole film's basically in one room, BK. That's a change.
It is. It is a big change. And the overall vibe is definitely different. But I think it's a cool testament to show that you can be lighthearted, you can be silly at times, and still tell realistic, hard stories that kind of get you all up in your feels. And really, The Breakfast Club is a film, one of two that we're kind of ending this season on that are very close to me and Jack personally with our families and kind of something that we've gravitated towards growing up and have a very deep and wholesome connection to. So I'm thrilled to be able to dive into that in our next episode and kind of share that with you all. And of course, we are going to be sharing this with the community. So if you're listening, if you're out there, our films are out there, the last there. So please join us. Let us know if you're following us on our Twitter at RFN_podcast or on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. We'll let you know when those are coming up. They're usually on Sundays where we like to share movies, rogue screenings with everyone. So don't hesitate to add us. We'll make sure you can find it.
And if you're still with us, feel free to tweet out the fact that BK likes a period piece.
No, don't do it. No, don't do it.
Go ahead and do that. That would be a fun thing to do.
Well, thank you so much for listening to us for so long. I think I had an amazing time today, and I enjoyed Jack going off today. You popped off today. You did that.
Hey, listen, I knew I was coming in needing to make a substantial defense, and I feel like I have acquitted myself quite well in that.
I like your word choice. But that's going to be it for us today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us, and we'll see you around next time.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.